Racist white man hits black woman on a plane, gets shocked when she fights back. A middle-aged white man with a racist attitude punched a young black woman on the plane without any reason, and he was shocked when she punched him back. The flight from Miami to Orlando was supposed to be a routine, quick hop over the Florida coast, filled with vacationers, business travelers, and families. Among them were two passengers seated uncomfortably close in economy class, each unaware of how their paths would cross that day. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Davies Mullen, a middle-aged man with a short temper and a deep sense of entitlement, boarded the plane with a sense of irritation. The flight was overbooked. He'd been bumped from first class, and now he was stuck in economy, squeezed between strangers in a row he deemed beneath him. To his right was a young black woman named Michelle Lewis, who carried herself with a quiet confidence. She was in her mid-20s, casually dressed, with a book in hand and headphones tucked around her neck. Davies glanced at Michelle with a dismissive glare, grumbling about the lack of decency these days. Michelle ignored him, her eyes trained on her book, sensing his hostility but choosing not to engage. Shortly after takeoff, the plane hit some mild turbulence. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and passengers settled in, some gripping their armrests. As the turbulence continued, the flight attendants suspended drink service, leaving everyone to wait out the bumpiness. Davies shifted uncomfortably in his seat, grumbling under his breath about everything from the cramped conditions to the incompetence of the airline. Suddenly, Davies turned to Michelle, his face twisted in frustration. "Can you stop jostling your seat around?" he snapped, even though she had been sitting quietly, barely moving at all. Michelle looked up, startled, but kept her tone calm. "Sir, I haven't moved." His face reddened, his voice rising. "Listen, young lady, I don't need attitude. I said stop moving, just be respectful and quiet." Other passengers turned to look, sensing the tension. Michelle took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm not doing anything to bother you, sir," she replied, determined not to let him intimidate her. But Davies's anger only grew. Without warning, he raised his hand and slapped Michelle's arm, his face twisted with frustration. "I said stop moving!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the cabin. Gasps filled the aisle as passengers watched in shock. Michelle's eyes widened in disbelief, her shock quickly turning into a fiery resolve. She stood up, steady and poised, her voice loud enough for everyone around them to hear. "You don't get to put your hands on me," she said, meeting his gaze squarely. Davies sneered, unrepentant, but before he could say anything more, Michelle's response took him completely off guard. In one swift move, she reached up and pressed the call button for the flight attendant. The cabin crew arrived quickly, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they took in the situation. Michelle calmly explained what had happened, while Davies, growing nervous under the scrutinizing stares, tried to brush it off. "It was just a little tap," he muttered, his arrogance faltering. The flight attendants weren't having it. "Sir, violence against another passenger is unacceptable," one of them said sternly. "We'll be documenting this incident and notifying authorities upon landing." The color drained from Davies's face. He stammered, trying to backtrack, but Michelle's calmness had shifted the entire mood of the cabin. Passengers who had initially been bystanders now voiced their support, sharing what they had seen and backing Michelle's account. What shocked Davies even more, however, was what Michelle said next. With a calm and steady voice, she spoke clearly for everyone to hear. "I'm an attorney," she announced, her gaze never leaving Davies's face, "and I will be pressing charges." The passengers around them murmured in approval, some even applauding. Davies's face paled as he realized the gravity of his actions. His arrogance, which he had relied on to intimidate and control, crumbled in the face of Michelle's calm assertion of power. He had expected a passive response, someone who would shrink away. Instead, he was faced with a formidable woman who would not back down. By the time the plane landed in Orlando, airport security was waiting. Davies was escorted off the plane, humiliated and in shock. He was processed by law enforcement, and Michelle filed an official report, determined to see justice served. News of the incident spread quickly, making headlines as a story of a young woman standing up to an aggressor. It wasn't just a story about an altercation on a plane. It became a symbol of resilience and the power of self-advocacy. In the weeks that followed, Davies faced not only legal consequences, but also social fallout. Actions were caught on phone cameras, and the footage went viral, shared by people who commended Michelle's courage in the face of his aggression. For Michelle, it wasn't just about pressing charges. It was about standing up for herself and showing others that no one, regardless of background or privilege, has the right to belittle or intimidate someone else. She received messages from people around the world, sharing their own stories of resilience, grateful for her example. And Davies, who had always wielded his status and privilege as a weapon, was left to confront the consequences of his actions in a way he'd never anticipated. His life, once built on the security of his unchallenged arrogance, was forever changed by that flight, and by the young woman who refused to back down. As the weeks rolled on, the ripple effects of the incident continued to reshape the lives of both Michelle and Davies in profound and unexpected ways. Michelle's story was soon picked up by major media outlets. Her calm yet firm response in the face of aggression resonated with people across the country. She became a symbol of strength and resilience, an example for others who had faced discrimination, aggression, or violence, but had felt too afraid to stand up. She was invited to speak at events and interviews, each time using her platform to shed light on the importance of standing up against any form of bullying, racism, or injustice. But her newfound visibility was not without challenges. While she had a groundswell of support, there were others who criticized her for escalating the situation or seeking attention. Each comment served as a reminder of the prejudices she'd long known existed, yet she remained undeterred, determined to use her voice for change. Her work as an attorney took on a new direction as well. She began dedicating more of her time to civil rights cases, representing those who faced discrimination or abuse of power. Meanwhile, Davies' life was unraveling. The video footage from the flight had gone viral, and his face was splashed across social media and news outlets. The backlash was intense, and he found himself facing an overwhelming amount of public outrage. Former friends distanced themselves, his workplace came under pressure to respond, and he was ultimately suspended from his job pending an internal investigation. What shocked Davies most, however, was not just the professional fallout. It was the personal reckoning that followed. Friends and family members who had once excused his temper or laughed off his occasional outbursts now saw him differently. A lifetime of unchecked privilege and entitlement was collapsing around him, and he was left feeling isolated and bewildered. As he watched the world condemn his actions, Davies found himself reflecting on moments he had long forgotten or dismissed. He thought of other times he'd lost his temper or acted out of entitlement, times when he'd spoken down to people he deemed inferior or overreacted in frustration. The mirror that society now held up to him was a harsh one, and he began to see the ugliness he had ignored for so long. One day, after weeks of self-reflection and soul-searching, Davies made a decision that surprised even himself. He reached out to Michelle. Unsure if she would even respond, he sent a letter, acknowledging his behavior on the plane, taking full accountability for his actions, and expressing a genuine desire to make amends. He admitted he had no right to treat her the way he did, and he confessed that the experience had forced him to confront a side of himself he was ashamed of. Michelle was shocked when she received the letter. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to dismiss his apology as too little, too late. But as she read his words, she could sense an unexpected authenticity in his remorse. After some thought, she decided to respond. Her reply was short but honest, expressing her hope that he would take his experience as an opportunity to grow and change, to use his privilege more responsibly in the future. Inspired by the conversations that emerged from their brief correspondence, Davies took a further step toward redemption. He began volunteering at local community centers, working on initiatives that addressed racism, classism, and other social issues he had previously dismissed as not his problem. He met people from all walks of life, learning from their experiences and facing hard truths about his own biases and blind spots. Through these efforts, Davies began to genuinely transform. He no longer saw himself as the victim of cancel culture, but rather as someone who had been given a rare chance to make amends, not just to Michelle, but to all those he had disrespected and disregarded over the years. Slowly, he found a new purpose, one that was centered not on entitlement, but on empathy, humility, and service to others. Months later, Michelle and Davies crossed paths again at a social justice conference where Michelle was invited as a speaker. Davies was there as a volunteer, working behind the scenes. Their eyes met across the room, and in a quiet moment afterward, Davies approached her, extending a hand in gratitude and respect. They exchanged a brief, silent understanding, a recognition of the journey they had both taken since that day on the plane. What began as a moment of aggression and confrontation had blossomed into something neither of them could have foreseen, a profound change in both their lives. Michelle continued her work as an advocate, using her voice to empower others, while Davies, once defined by arrogance, found his purpose in supporting those who faced the struggles he had once disregarded. Their paths had crossed under the worst of circumstances, yet, somehow, both had emerged from that encounter with a deeper sense of compassion and purpose. What had started as a simple flight had become a journey that reshaped their lives in ways they would never forget. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll make me very happy. Thank you. And I look forward to your like.